What an insane month we've been having in the Ragnarok verse. Of course, both the full breakdown for chapter 97 and the full breakdown for Apocalypse of the Gods chapter 7 are both up on the channel if you missed them. But man, do we have a ton to talk about today in regards to Siegfried, Satan, and the primordial treasures of calamity in general. Before that though, if you like the content like this and want to stay on this side of the Ragnarok YouTube algorithm, make sure you subscribe to this channel and drop a like on the video so you don't miss any of the news in the upcoming months. So in chapter 97 of Ragnarok, we hear the tales of the primordial god war in which Odin reigns supreme among the Yggdrasil, the four strongest primordial gods, and they waged war against the 77 other primordials alongside 7 others of their own faction. With this, we found out about the brutality of Odin. We found out that Odin himself was actually one of the initial primordial gods, and the Odin we see today is actually different from that one because he was just a nameless god who found the artifact of Odin, got some of Odin's power, got his wisdom, and thus ascended to rule the Norse pantheon, create that pantheon essentially, and away we go into where we are today. Now, we find out these tales from Siegfried, the man that is mysteriously chained up in Tartarus despite the fact that his crimes don't seem befitting of the punishment, especially given that Buddha said Tartarus is usually reserved for insurrection against Valhalla or assassination of major gods. Yet the only crimes that Siegfried is assumed to have committed are stealing Odin's magic sword Balmung and killing Odin's favorite fire dragon Fafnir. Buddha continues and says that this whole ordeal is very fishy, especially considering that even if these small oopsies that he calls them are enough to piss off Odin, Odin would usually just eradicate the person on the spot. It still doesn't explain why he's in Tartarus, especially that it's this extremely exclusive prison. We also know that Siegfried is of course the lover of Hilda, and Hilda seems to have started the Ragnarok tournament as a conduit to be able to free her lover. And then even in chapter 96, she was talking about putting Odin into a corner to potentially see Siegfried once again. With all this, Buddha comes to the conclusion that it's not just Hilda that has some kind of relationship with Siegfried, but Siegfried has some kind of importance to Odin as well. Now, when I first read this, I had initially thought that Siegfried was going to be the son or potential grandson of Odin. That still may be true, but I think that with what we know today and the process by which Odin got his power, I do think that Siegfried is looking like a potential vessel for one of the primordial gods. Now, initially, these things seem kind of throwaway as they could just be part of the established lore of the character, right? But after this chapter, after seeing this sword right here called Gram, things change dramatically. Now, the author is doing something very sneaky right here because actually in Norse mythology, to my knowledge, from some quick little research, Balmung and Gram are actually the same sword. Balmung is just a reforged version of said sword, and that is the one that Siegfried wields in mythology, but it is the same sword as Gram. Here's Google's AI overview as well. This means, if this is true, this means that Siegfried has the sword that essentially is the primordial god Odin's rune. This makes a ton of sense given that Odin, in the flashback, fights with the sword. We saw Odin currently not fight with the sword. He fights with gun gear against Beelzebub and Buddha. Now, it's possible like, oh, he just didn't want to use the sword, but I doubt it. I doubt it. I think he had to get gun gear because he lost his sword. He lost his fighting weapon. There's a couple different things that this could mean. This could mean that Odin just simply wants to get it back because he can't go back to his full power. He can't fight at his full power without that sword. Or it could mean that Siegfried could be in contention to be the vessel of that primordial god Odin. Now, it's super unclear. This chapter was extremely confusing. A ton of people are confused in my comments whether or not the primordial god Odin has simply overtaken the Odin we have today, and it is effectively primordial god Odin just in a much weaker state, basically just controlling a host of a nameless god, or if the nameless god himself just was granted Odin's wisdom, has the same memories effectively, and wants to get more power, free the other primordials, and potentially free the full power of the primordial god Odin. When we get those questions answered, we'll have a much clearer picture. But at the very least, if he stole that sword, from all accounts, you have to be worthy to wield these calamities. And as soon as Odin picked up the sword, he got overwhelmed with all the power. Does that mean that when Siegfried picked up the sword as well, that same power flowed into him? Is that how he has all the knowledge he has right now? I'm just saying, maybe there's an actual war going on where like two people have a piece of primordial Odin in them. And until Odin figures out how to get that power back out of Siegfried, or how to fully bring about Odin within Siegfried, it's imperative that he keeps him alive. And that is why he has issued him a doctor in Nostradamus. But at the same time, he wants to torture him to potentially give up that power. That might be the situation we're in. Now, it's also possible Odin wants to keep him for another reason, which would be being the vessel of another primordial. The thing that I do find interesting about this all is that in this chapter, chapter 97, we find out that Odin is specifically compatible with primordial Odin's rune. So there has to be a compatibility factor. That is why I think that this theory makes even more sense, because if it's not just so simple as finding any random god to be the vessel for this primordial, it would make a lot of sense why Odin would be keeping Siegfried alive as somebody that can harness the power of one of these primordials. Another interesting aspect of all this is that Izanagi, a primordial god, was a participant in that war, the giant war, and yet he is still around today. He was in the crowd watching Susanoo, his son, lose to Okita Tsuji, went down into the arena to heal Okita. So he is very much active to this day. He is prominently being shown. Like, it did seem like he kind of stays in the shadows, lets Amaterasu run the Pantheon, but he's in charge. He's their father, and he's a primordial, so he sits above them. He's stronger than them. So I was a little surprised that he actually showed up to the arena. Big questions are arising from people in my comment section, like, how does this make any sense if Izanagi was part of the primordial war and he sees this guy calling himself Odin that looks very similar to the Odin that he fought against, now very prominent in the verse? No questions are being raised. He's not going to tell anybody else about this. It is very odd and needs to be addressed at this point. Otherwise, it's going to be a major plot hole, as Izanagi should know the threat of Odin and be suspicious of him from the very beginning. There's no way you can tell me he doesn't suspect this Odin. So I would watch out for him to be a major part of the storyline going forward, because it isn't just so simple as him participating in the war. He saw the 4 calamity treasures leave the seal. So he knows that these things are out there. He knows that they had a last ditch effort to do something, and he knows about Odin. This needs to be addressed. A couple other interesting notes were Satan fought with this scythe, and we actually get a panel of scythe prominently featured, as well as confirmation that that skull is not his face. That was just a mask, because he took the mask off. That's of course his divine treasure, and we actually get a little shot in the background with him without the mask. So we will see him without a mask at some point. That will be very interesting. Now, as far as the scythe, I don't know how much this is going to tie into the Apocalypse of the Gods lore that we're going to get, but there's a couple of things that pique my interest in connection to Satan going into that. We have a ton of death gods or demons, underworld rulers in the Apocalypse of the Gods tournament, and they're pretty much all backloaded into the second half of the bracket. Now, what that means is that there's going to be a lot more development in the main Record of Ragnarok story by the time we get to those fights, meaning that there could be much more lore about Satan by the time we get there. Also, you're going to assume that Death, the Shinigami, is going to fight with the Scythe if they follow with a more westernized depiction of the Grim Reaper. If he fought with a Scythe, imagine that guy fights with Satan's Scythe. There's so much that could be expounded upon with all these demonic beings coming up in the Apocalypse of the Gods manga, so I wanted to bring that to your guys' attention. But I'm super excited for where we go in the series going forward. As you can tell, next Record of Ragnarok video that comes out will be my preview predictions for chapter 98, so make sure you stay tuned for all that. Let me know in the comments what you think of all the stuff we talked about here and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.